The Starlight Harbor Tavern hummed with the controlled chaos that marked successful neutral territory, beings from a dozen different species conducting business, sharing information, and occasionally celebrating deals with beverages that ranged from simple human alcohol to exotic compounds that could induce euphoria in silicon-based life forms. Jake Sullivan navigated the crowded space with practiced efficiency, his serving tray balanced despite the constant movement required to avoid stepping on tentacles, tails, or the various appendages that different species used for locomotion. 2 Altarian fire wines and a human whiskey to table 7, he announced to the bar, where Kextal the bartender managed an inventory of intoxicants that could kill, heal, or enlighten depending on the consumer's biology. The Zephyrians at table 12 are getting loud, Kextal observed, his multiple arms working with fluid precision to prepare drinks while his eye stalks monitored the tavern's social dynamics. Their celebration seems to be testing noise ordinances. Jake glanced toward the corner where 6 young Zephyrians occupied a table sized for their elongated frames, their pointed ears flushed with the effects of fermented beverages that affected their neurochemistry in ways that made them more social but significantly less inhibited. Their clothing indicated aristocratic status, expensive fabrics, ceremonial jewelry, and the confident bearing that marked beings accustomed to deference from social inferiors. Trade negotiation success, Jake explained, having overheard enough of their conversation to understand the celebration's purpose. Something about securing exclusive rights to rare mineral extraction in the Vega system. Profitable business. Which explains why they're drinking beverages that cost more than most beings earn in a month. Jake collected the drink orders and made his way toward table 12, noting that the Zephyrians' conversation had shifted from business success to increasingly loud discussions about their species' cultural superiority and territorial accomplishments. Such topics edged toward the political discussions that tavern neutrality protocol strictly prohibited. "Honored guests," he said in carefully neutral Standard Galactic, "your requested beverages. May I recommend keeping conversation focused on personal celebration rather than territorial matters? The management prefers to maintain neutrality on political topics." The apparent group leader, a young male whose ceremonial scarring indicated military academy training, looked up with the expression beings often wore when addressed by service personnel they considered beneath notice. "Human waiter," he said with casual condescension, "we are celebrating legitimate business success. Our conversation topics are not subject to your approval." "Of course not, honored guest. I'm simply sharing tavern policy that helps maintain the peaceful environment that benefits all patrons." A female Zephyrian at the table's head watched Jake's response with obvious interest, her intelligent eyes suggesting someone who paid attention to social dynamics rather than simply enjoying privilege. Unlike her companions, she seemed curious about the human who spoke their language with diplomatic precision despite his service position. "You handle interspecies tensions professionally," she observed, her Standard Galactic carrying the precise pronunciation that marked advanced education. "Most human service workers avoid direct engagement with political topics. Experience teaches caution when different species gather in confined spaces, honored guest. Misunderstandings can escalate quickly when alcohol affects judgment. And you have extensive experience with such situations?" Jake set down their beverages with careful attention to Zephyrian's serving customs, noting that the female, who appeared to be the group's social center despite not being the loudest, continued studying his responses with analytical attention. 3 years working neutral territory provides education in diplomatic necessity, honored guest. Different species require different approaches to maintain peaceful coexistence. "Kiranel," she said, offering her name with the formal courtesy that Zephyrian culture reserved for acknowledging social equals. "You may address me by name rather than title." "Thank you, Kiranel. I'm Jake. Please signal if you require additional service." As he departed, Jake heard her companions teasing her about showing interest in the human servant, their voices carrying the casual prejudice that marked beings who'd never needed to consider other species as individuals rather than categorical abstractions. The evening progressed with the usual complexity that marked mixed species social environments. Jake mediated between a Corvallian trader and human merchant whose business dispute was escalating toward physical confrontation, redirected a group of Centauri cadets who were harassing other patrons, and maintained careful neutrality when political discussions threatened to violate tavern protocols. Through it all, he noticed that Kiranel continued observing the tavern's social dynamics with obvious fascination. Unlike her companions, who treated the establishment as entertainment designed for their amusement, she seemed genuinely curious about how different species interacted when removed from their usual hierarchical contexts. "The Zephyrian noble is watching you," Kextal observed during a brief lull in service demands. "Either you've impressed her with your diplomatic skills, or she's planning to file a complaint about human service quality. Probably curiosity about interspecies social dynamics." Her companions seem more interested in demonstrating superiority than understanding other perspectives. Young aristocrats often lack exposure to neutral environments. For some, this may be their first extended contact with non-Zephyrian beings in social rather than formal contexts. Jake nodded, understanding that Kiranel's sheltered upbringing had probably provided limited opportunity to observe humans as individuals rather than diplomatic abstractions. Her interest might represent genuine intellectual curiosity about species she'd been taught to consider inferior. Table 12 requests additional service, announced the tavern's automated monitoring system. Customer satisfaction indicators suggest positive reception of current service protocols. Jake gathered fresh beverages and returned to the Zephyrian table, where the celebration had reached levels of intoxication that made their conversation increasingly loud and their social inhibitions correspondingly diminished. "Jake the diplomat," Kiranel said with obvious pleasure at his return, her pronunciation slightly affected by alcohol consumption. "My companions have been discussing your remarkable ability to manage interspecies tensions without causing offense." "They have?" Jake looked at her companions, whose expression suggested they'd been discussing him in terms that probably weren't entirely flattering. "Yes. They find it amusing that a human service worker demonstrates more cultural competence than most trained diplomats." The backhanded compliment contained enough genuine observation to suggest that Kiranel was defending his abilities against her companion's prejudicial assumptions, though her diplomatic phrasing avoided directly contradicting their social attitudes. The Zephyrian celebration had reached the stage where cultural inhibitions began competing with alcohol-enhanced confidence, creating exactly the kind of volatile social mixture that Jake had learned to monitor carefully during his years in neutral territory. Their conversations grew louder, their gestures more expansive, and their comments about other species increasingly pointed despite tavern protocols that discouraged such discussions. "The human colonies in Sector 7 demonstrate typical human short-sightedness," declared the military-trained Zephyrian who'd appointed himself group spokesman. "They establish settlements without adequate consideration of long-term environmental impact." "Velkar speaks truth," agreed another male, raising his glass in a gesture that sloshed expensive liquor onto the table. "Human colonial planning lacks the systematic thinking that Zephyrian territorial development requires." Jake approached their table with fresh beverages, noting that nearby patrons, including several humans, were beginning to take interest in conversations that bordered on prohibited political territory. "Honored guests," he said diplomatically, "perhaps discussion of territorial development might be more appropriate in private venues. Other patrons may have different perspectives on colonial policies." "Are you suggesting," Velkar said with dangerous quiet, "that Zephyrian observations about human inadequacy should be censored to protect human feelings?" The question created exactly the kind of confrontational moment that could escalate beyond Jake's ability to manage diplomatically. He noticed that several human patrons had stopped their own conversations to listen, while Kiranel watched the developing situation with obvious concern. "I'm suggesting that neutral territory serves everyone better when we focus on shared interests rather than competitive assessments of species capabilities," Jake replied carefully. "Shared interests?" Velkar laughed with genuine amusement. "What interests could humans possibly share with beings whose technological and cultural achievements exceed human development by centuries?" Before Jake could respond, a human merchant at a nearby table stood with the aggressive posture that indicated someone whose patience had reached its limit. "Maybe," the merchant said in a voice that carried across the tavern, Humans share an interest in not listening to drunken aliens insult our intelligence while enjoying the hospitality of human-operated establishments. The silence that followed demonstrated how quickly neutral social environments could transform into potential battlegrounds when species pride collided with alcohol-enhanced judgment. "Thomas," Jake said quietly to the human merchant, "these guests are celebrating business success. I'm sure they didn't intend any disrespect to human achievements. Didn't they?" Thomas replied, his attention focused on Velkar with the intensity that preceded either diplomacy or violence. "Because it sounded like they were explaining why humans are too stupid to deserve territorial rights in our own settlements." Kiranel chose that moment to intervene with the kind of diplomatic skill that suggested formal training in conflict resolution. "Honored human merchant," she said, rising from her seat with careful grace despite her obvious intoxication, my companion's words reflected celebration enthusiasm rather than considered analysis. "Zephyrian trade success depends on human commercial partnerships, which require mutual respect and understanding." Her intervention created space for de-escalation by acknowledging the merchant's legitimate grievance while providing her companion with an opportunity to retreat from confrontational positions without losing face. Furthermore, she continued, looking directly at Velkar, neutral territory protocols exist precisely to prevent political discussions that serve no constructive purpose. Perhaps we should focus on celebrating our business success rather than analyzing other species' territorial policies. Jake watched the interaction with professional admiration for diplomatic technique that managed to address everyone's concerns while steering conversation away from dangerous territory. "Lady Kiranel speaks wisdom," Velkar agreed, though his tone suggested grudging acceptance rather than enthusiastic agreement. "Our celebration should focus on Zephyrian achievements rather than human limitations." The phrasing still carried implicit insult, but offered enough accommodation to allow the human merchant to return to his own table without appearing to back down from confrontation. "Well handled," Jake said quietly to Kiranel as the tension level in the tavern returned to normal background levels. "Diplomatic training includes conflict prevention as well as resolution," she replied. "Though I fear my companion's judgment is becoming increasingly compromised by celebration enthusiasm. Alcohol affects different species in different ways. Zephyrian neurochemistry responds to fermented beverages by reducing social inhibitions while enhancing confidence in personal opinions. An unfortunate combination in mixed-species environments." Jake found himself genuinely impressed by Kiranel's intellectual approach to social complexity. Unlike her companions, who seemed to view the tavern as entertainment designed for their amusement, she demonstrated genuine understanding of the diplomatic challenges that neutral territory presented. "You have extensive knowledge of interspecies social dynamics," she observed, studying his face with analytical attention that made him slightly uncomfortable. "Most service workers lack such detailed understanding of species-specific behavioral patterns. Experience provides education that formal training sometimes misses. 3 years of managing mixed-species environments teaches practical lessons about cultural sensitivity and conflict prevention. And before your service work, your background includes formal education in diplomatic protocols." The question approached personal territory that Jake preferred to avoid discussing with intoxicated nobility, though Kiranel's obvious intelligence suggested that casual deflection wouldn't satisfy her curiosity. "Various experiences contribute to cultural competence," he replied diplomatically. "Military service, civilian education, practical necessity." "Military service?" Her ears perked forward with increased attention. "Human military forces include interspecies cultural training. Some assignments require understanding of non-human social dynamics and communication patterns." Kiranel's expression showed the kind of intense curiosity that suggested someone whose sheltered upbringing had provided limited exposure to military realities despite her species' warrior culture. "And you chose service work after military career completion?" "Neutral territory provides opportunities for beings with diverse backgrounds. The work suits my temperament and utilizes skills that military service developed." Jake realized that their conversation was attracting attention from Kiranel's companions, who seemed to find her extended discussion with a human service worker either amusing or mildly scandalous. "Kiranel," called one of the females, "Are you conducting anthropological research on human service personnel? Should we record your observations for academic publication?" The comment carried enough mockery to make Jake consider ending the conversation, though Kiranel's embarrassed expression suggested that her companion's attitudes didn't reflect her own views. "I find interspecies social dynamics fascinating," she replied with dignity that managed to acknowledge their teasing while defending her genuine interest. "Neutral territory provides opportunities for observation that formal diplomatic contexts don't allow. Then perhaps you should conduct more direct research," suggested Velkar with the kind of smile that indicated someone whose inhibitions had been thoroughly compromised by alcohol. "Hands-on investigation of human social responses." Velkar's suggestion about hands-on investigation created an atmosphere of expectant amusement among the Zephyrian nobles that made Jake increasingly uncomfortable with the direction their conversation was taking. What had begun as intellectual curiosity about interspecies dynamics was evolving into something that felt more like entertainment at his expense. "My companions find human-Zephyrian social interaction amusing," Kiranel said, her voice carrying embarrassment that suggested she recognized the inappropriate nature of their suggestions. "Please ignore their comments. Alcohol affects Zephyrian judgment in ways that compromise social courtesy." "No offense taken," Jake replied diplomatically, though he began looking for graceful opportunities to excuse himself from their table. "Neutral territory requires tolerance for various forms of cultural expression." "But surely," Velkar persisted with the aggressive friendliness that marks someone whose inhibitions had been thoroughly compromised, "human service workers must be curious about Zephyrian social customs. Kiranel could provide educational experiences that formal diplomatic contexts don't allow." The suggestion carried implications that made Jake's professional instincts warn him to extract himself from the situation before it evolved into something that could compromise both his employment and the tavern's neutrality protocols. "I appreciate your guest's interest in cultural exchange," he said carefully, "but duty requires attention to other patrons' needs. Please signal if you require additional service." He turned to leave, but Kiranel's voice stopped him with what sounded like genuine distress. "Jake, please don't judge all Zephyrians by my companion's behavior. Their suggestions don't represent our species' normal social standards." The apology was sincere enough to make him pause despite his desire to escape the increasingly awkward situation. "No judgment intended, Kiranel. Different species express celebration in different ways. But you're offended by their implications about human-Zephyrian interaction. I'm concerned about maintaining professional boundaries that serve everyone's interests." Kiranel stood with the careful precision that marked someone whose coordination was being affected by alcohol but who retained enough awareness to recognize social complexity. "Then perhaps private conversation would be more appropriate," she suggested, though her slightly unsteady movement made Jake wonder whether she was thinking clearly about the implications of such a proposal. Kiranel, called one of her female companions, "Are you planning to conduct personal research on human social responses? How fascinating. Do document your observations for our entertainment." The mockery in the comment made Kiranel's ears flush with embarrassment, though her expression showed determination to prove something to her companions about her ability to interact with non-Zephyrian beings. "I am capable of intelligent conversation with individuals regardless of their species or social position," she declared with aristocratic dignity that was only slightly compromised by alcohol's effects on her pronunciation. "Of course you are," Velkar agreed with obvious amusement. "Human service workers are probably grateful for any attention from Zephyrian nobility. I'm sure Jake would be honored by your personal interest." Jake felt the situation spiraling beyond his ability to manage diplomatically. Kiranel's companions were treating her curiosity about human culture as entertainment while simultaneously using him as an object for their amusement, creating dynamics that could only end badly for everyone involved. "Honored guests," he said with formal courtesy, "I must attend to other duties. Your celebration has been most educational, but—" "Wait," Kiranel said, reaching toward him with the expansive gesture that alcohol encouraged. "I want to understand human perspectives on interspecies cooperation. Your insights could inform policy discussions that affect both our peoples." Her movement was more animated than her usual controlled grace, the effects of celebration making her normally precise coordination slightly unpredictable. Jake stepped back to maintain appropriate distance, but her gesture continued with momentum that brought her closer than either had intended. "Kieran, he said quietly, perhaps this conversation would be better continued when circumstances allow for more thoughtful discussion." "Now is perfect," she insisted, her intellectual curiosity overriding social caution in ways that suggested alcohol was affecting her judgment more significantly than he'd realized. "My companions doubt that humans possess sufficient intelligence for meaningful cultural exchange. I want to prove them wrong. Your companions' opinions shouldn't require proof through public demonstration." "But they do," she said with the passionate intensity that marked someone whose pride had been challenged. "They assume human intellectual inferiority without evidence. Direct conversation provides counter-evidence they cannot dismiss." Jake realized that Kieran was using him to make a point about species prejudice to her companions, though her alcohol-impaired judgment was creating a situation that could easily become problematic for both of them. "Kieran," he said gently, "proving points about human intelligence doesn't require personal interaction that compromises your dignity or my professional position." "What compromise?" she asked, genuinely confused by his concern. "Conversation between intelligent beings transcends social position or species difference." Her philosophical approach to the situation demonstrated admirable idealism but concerning naivety about the practical implications of their interaction. Jake could see her companions watching with expressions that ranged from amusement to anticipation of embarrassing outcomes. "The compromise," he explained patiently, "involves expectations that your companions are developing about the nature of human-Zephyrian interaction. Their suggestions indicate assumptions that could create uncomfortable situations. Then I will demonstrate that interspecies communication can be dignified and mutually respectful," she declared, though her slightly slurred pronunciation suggested that alcohol was continuing to affect her cognitive processes. "Kieran, your intentions are admirable, but your current state may not be ideal for conducting diplomatic demonstrations." "My state is perfectly adequate for intelligent conversation," she insisted, though her attempt to gesture emphatically resulted in unsteady movement that confirmed Jake's concerns about her coordination. The situation had reached the point where Jake needed to either extract himself immediately or accept responsibility for managing an intoxicated aristocrat whose judgment was clearly compromised by alcohol and peer pressure. "Perhaps," he suggested diplomatically, "we could continue this discussion when circumstances allow for more private and thoughtful conversation." "No," Kieran said with stubborn determination, "now is the perfect time for demonstrating that humans and Zephyrians can interact as intellectual equals." She reached toward him again, this time with more purpose than her previous gesture, though her alcohol-affected coordination made her movement less precise than she probably intended. Kieran's reach toward Jake carried the confident expectation that physical contact would demonstrate the friendship and equality she wanted to prove to her companions, but her alcohol-impaired coordination turned the gesture into something far more dramatic than either had anticipated. Her claws, evolved for precision grip but compromised by celebration enthusiasm, caught the fabric of his service shirt and tore through it with a sound that cut through the tavern's background noise like a blade. The ripping fabric created a moment of shocked silence as conversations throughout the establishment paused and dozens of beings turned toward the commotion. Kieran's initial reaction was embarrassed laughter at her own clumsiness, the alcohol making her find humor in what should have been a mortifying social mistake. "Oh," she giggled, her ears flushing with embarrassment as she stared at the torn shirt hanging open across Jake's chest, "I seem to have damaged your uniform. How terribly clumsy of me." Her companions burst into delighted laughter at the spectacle, their voices carrying across the tavern with commentary about Zephyrian superior strength and human clothing quality that made Jake wish the floor would open and swallow him entirely. "Well done, Kieran." Velkar called out with obvious amusement. "Very thorough investigation of human garment construction. Should we bill this as research expenses?" But as Kieran's eyes focused on Jake's exposed chest, her expression transformed with startling speed from embarrassed amusement to absolute shock. The laughter died in her throat as her gaze locked onto the intricate tattoos that covered his torso, markings that combined human military honors with symbols that made her face go pale despite her species' natural coloration. The tattoos were unmistakable to anyone with knowledge of recent military history. Across Jake's chest, intertwined with human special forces insignia, were the sacred symbols of Zephyrian gratitude, the spiral patterns that marked individuals who had performed extraordinary service to her people, awarded only by the High Command for actions that transcended normal heroism. The Kepler markings, she whispered, her voice barely audible despite the tavern's sudden silence. You were there. Jake felt his stomach drop as he realized that his carefully maintained anonymity had been destroyed by a drunken accident. The Kepler massacre was not something he discussed, especially not with Zephyrian nobility whose lives had been shaped by the events he'd been ordered never to reveal. Kiranel, he said quietly, reaching for the torn edges of his shirt to cover the tattoos that marked him as someone whose past was supposed to remain classified, it's not important. Not important. Her voice carried a mix of awe and horror that made every being in the tavern strain to understand what had created such a dramatic reaction. Those are recognition marks from the High Command. Sacred symbols awarded to. She stopped speaking as the full implications hit her, her expression showing the kind of shock that came from suddenly understanding that reality was far different than she'd believed. The Kepler rescue, she continued in a voice that trembled with emotions Jake couldn't identify, 3 years ago. The colony ship that was attacked by pirates in the Vega system. Jake nodded reluctantly, knowing that denial would be pointless now that she'd seen the markings that identified his role in the military engagement that both species preferred to forget. You were part of the human special forces unit that responded to our distress calls, she said, her words carrying across the silent tavern where every patron now listened with rapt attention to revelations that explained why a human service worker carried Zephyrian sacred symbols. I was, Jake admitted, understanding that his quiet life in neutral territory had just ended with the exposure of service records that were supposed to remain classified indefinitely. Kiranel stared at him with expressions that cycled through shock, recognition, and growing horror as she processed not just his identity but the implications of how she and her companions had been treating him. The colony ship, she whispered, carried my family. My parents, my younger siblings, over 300 Zephyrian civilians including diplomatic personnel returning from trade negotiations. The silent tavern absorbed this information as beings from multiple species began to understand that they were witnessing something far more significant than a drunken accident involving torn clothing. Your unit, Kiranel continued, her voice gaining strength as the full picture became clear, responded to our distress signals when the pirates disabled our engines and began executing passengers to encourage cooperation with their demands. Jake remained silent, knowing that military protocols still classified the operation's details even though its existence was public knowledge among both species' leadership. The official reports, she said, her ears trembling with emotion that made her voice shake, indicated that human special forces engaged the pirate vessels in combat that resulted in successful rescue of Zephyrian civilians, though at significant cost to the rescue force. Kiranel, Jake said gently, the operation achieved its objectives. That's what matters. What matters, she replied with increasing intensity, is that 8 human soldiers died saving Zephyrian lives, and the survivors were granted sacred recognition that our people reserve for those who demonstrate courage beyond normal heroism. The tavern's silence had become complete as beings absorbed the revelation that their quiet human waiter was a decorated veteran of one of the most significant interspecies rescue operations in recent history. How many? Kiranel asked, though her expression suggested she already knew the answer. How many of your unit survived? 3, Jake replied quietly, understanding that she needed to hear the full truth about what his tattoos represented. 3 survivors out of 12, she repeated, her voice carrying the weight of someone who was realizing that her family's lives had been purchased with human blood. And you've been working as a service employee while carrying honors that should make you a hero to both our peoples. The work suits me, Jake said simply, though his voice carried undertones that suggested the decision to remain anonymous hadn't been entirely voluntary. Kiranel looked around the tavern at her companions, whose expressions had shifted from amusement to stunned silence as they processed the implications of what they'd witnessed. We have been, she said with dawning horror, treating you like a servant whose opinions were insignificant entertainment for our amusement. You didn't know, Jake replied, though the weight of their casual condescension still stung despite his understanding of their ignorance. We should have known, she said with the intensity that marked someone whose worldview was undergoing fundamental revision. We should have recognized quality and character regardless of social position or species identity. She knelt in the traditional Zephyrian gesture of profound respect, her action creating a ripple of movement throughout the tavern as other beings responded to the unprecedented sight of Zephyrian nobility honoring a human. Jake Sullivan, she said with formal precision, on behalf of my family, my people, and everyone whose lives were preserved through your sacrifice, I offer the gratitude that should have been expressed the moment we met. Jake looked down at the young Zephyrian noble whose drunken clumsiness had revealed secrets he'd spent 3 years keeping hidden, and realized that sometimes the most profound truths emerged through the most unexpected circumstances. Kiranel, he said gently, offering his hand to help her stand, your gratitude honors me, but it's not necessary. We all serve according to our abilities and circumstances. Perhaps, she replied, accepting his assistance while maintaining eye contact that carried newfound respect, but some service deserves recognition regardless of the humility of those who provide it. As the tavern slowly returned to normal conversation levels, Jake realized that his anonymous life in neutral territory had ended, but perhaps that wasn't entirely unfortunate. Sometimes the masks people wore to blend into ordinary society needed to be removed for genuine connections to form. Jake, Kiranel said quietly, her earlier intoxication seeming to have evaporated in the face of profound revelation, may I ask why you chose service work rather than accepting the honors and recognition that your actions earned? Because, he replied, carefully fastening the torn edges of his shirt while dozens of eyes continued to watch their interaction, heroism is what you do when circumstances require it, not a career qualification for preferential treatment. But the Zephyrian High Command offered you permanent diplomatic status, citizenship, even territorial grants in recognition of your service. The records show extensive offers that were declined. Jake looked around the tavern where beings from multiple species now regarded him with expressions ranging from curiosity to respect, understanding that his careful anonymity had been permanently shattered by an accident that revealed truths he'd worked to keep hidden. I preferred to earn my place through current contributions rather than past actions, he said simply. Service work provides opportunities to help people without the complications that come with heroic reputation. Velkar, who had been silent since the revelation began, stood and approached their conversation with the hesitant demeanor of someone whose assumptions had been thoroughly demolished. Human Jake, he said with formal courtesy that contrasted sharply with his earlier condescension, I must offer profound apology for treatment that failed to recognize your character and achievements. No apology necessary, Jake replied diplomatically. You responded based on available information. Different circumstances might have led to different interactions. Nevertheless, Velkar continued, our behavior demonstrated the exact kind of species prejudice that your actions at Kepler proved unfounded. We assumed human inferiority without considering individual merit. Kiranel nodded, her expression showing continued struggle with the implications of her own behavior. We treated you as entertainment rather than recognizing the person whose courage made our current lives possible. And in doing so, added another of her companions, we proved that privilege can blind people to the extraordinary character of those around them. Jake felt the weight of attention from throughout the tavern as beings processed the revelation that their quiet waiter carried honors that marked him as a hero to multiple species. The comfortable anonymity that had allowed him to serve without recognition was gone, replaced by awareness that would fundamentally change every future interaction. The question now, Kiranel said thoughtfully, is how this knowledge changes our understanding of interspecies cooperation and individual worth. It doesn't have to change anything, Jake replied. People are who they choose to be through their daily actions, not who they were during extraordinary circumstances. But extraordinary circumstances reveal character that ordinary situations might never test, she observed. Your willingness to risk everything for beings you'd never met demonstrates qualities that transcend species boundaries. And, Velkar added with growing conviction, your choice to seek ordinary work rather than trading on heroic reputation demonstrates humility that makes your character even more remarkable. The conversation was drawing continued attention from throughout the tavern as beings absorbed the implications of what they'd witnessed. Jake realized that his exposure would probably result in changes to his employment situation, his social interactions, and his ability to maintain the quiet life he'd built in neutral territory. "Kieran, he said carefully, I hope this revelation doesn't create obligations or expectations that complicate your life or your family's political positions." "On the contrary," she replied with growing certainty, "this revelation clarifies obligations that should have been recognized long ago." She activated her personal communication device and began speaking in rapid Zephyrian to someone whose authority apparently exceeded even her aristocratic status. "Father," she said, her words carrying across the now silent tavern, "I have located someone whose service to our family requires immediate recognition and compensation." Jake listened to her end of the conversation with growing alarm as she described their meeting and the circumstances that had revealed his identity. "Yes, Father, the human special forces veteran from the Kepler rescue. He has been working as service personnel in neutral territory while carrying sacred honors that our people granted but apparently never properly supported." The conversation continued for several minutes while Kieran provided details about Jake's current circumstances and her assessment of how their meeting had revealed inadequacies in Zephyrian follow-up regarding heroes who had served their people. "Kieran," Jake said when she concluded the call, "I hope you haven't created diplomatic complications through well-intentioned but unnecessary interventions." "I have," she replied with satisfaction, "created diplomatic opportunities that should have existed 3 years ago." "Meaning?" "Meaning that my father, who serves on the Zephyrian High Council, has authorized immediate offers of positions that utilize your expertise in interspecies relations rather than wasting your talents on service work." Jake felt his carefully constructed ordinary life continuing to crumble as revelation created consequences he'd spent years avoiding. "Furthermore," Kieran continued, "he has requested permission to meet with you personally to discuss how Zephyrian recognition of human heroism can be properly expressed through ongoing cooperation rather than symbolic gestures." "And if I prefer to continue my current employment?" "Then," she said with the radiant smile that transformed her aristocratic features into something genuinely warm, "you will do so with the understanding that your service has meaning that extends far beyond taking drink orders." Jake looked around the tavern where his anonymous life had ended through accidental revelation, seeing expressions of respect that he'd never sought but apparently couldn't avoid. "Jake," Kieran said quietly, "thank you for saving my family. And thank you for demonstrating that true character reveals itself through daily choices rather than dramatic gestures. Thank you for reminding me that sometimes the masks we wear to protect ourselves also prevent the connections that make service meaningful." As the evening continued and the tavern's social dynamics adjusted to accommodate new understanding of their human waiter's extraordinary background, Jake realized that his exposure had created possibilities for genuine relationship that anonymity had never allowed. Sometimes, he reflected, the most important revelations came through the most unexpected circumstances, and sometimes being seen for who you really were was worth the loss of protective invisibility.